The clock ticked. Stan watched his wife, Helen, from across the room. She hummed, her back to him, sorting through her purse. Something was different, he thought. Helen had been distant lately, secrets swirling in her eyes. He'd seen her like this before. Years ago, when she'd almost left him for another man. The memory stung, a dull ache in his chest. Had it started again? Was history repeating itself? His gaze lingered on her purse, a sleek black leather number he'd gifted her last Christmas. It seemed to bulge slightly, hiding something within its depths. A wave of nausea washed over him. What was she keeping from him? He longed to ask, to confront the silence that stretched between them like a chasm. But fear held him captive. Fear of the answer, fear of pushing her further away. So, he remained silent, a prisoner of his own tormented thoughts. Later that night, while Helen slept, Stan gave in to the demons gnawing at his sanity. He crept from their bed, each step a betrayal of trust he couldn't afford but couldn't resist. Her purse lay discarded on the nightstand, a silent temptress. His hand trembled as he reached for it, a cold sweat slicking his palms. He found it nestled amongst her lipstick and compact, a small, unmarked vial filled with a shimmering, opalescent liquid, a youth serum. The words flashed across his mind, ripped from the pages of some pulp science fiction novel. But the serum was real, held captive in his hand. And Helen, his Helen, possessed it. Why? The question echoed through the hollow chambers of his heart. Was this the reason for her recent distance, her newfound air of secrecy? Was she seeking a way out of their marriage, a way to recapture her lost youth? With someone else? The next morning, Stan watched as Helen stirred a spoonful of honey into her tea. His eyes, however, were fixed on the vial, now empty, discarded carelessly on the countertop. He'd watched her at it, watched the innocuous tea transform into a potential elixir of betrayal. He said nothing. Couldn't. The words stuck in his throat, choked by the fear and suspicion that had taken root in his soul. He watched as she took a sip, her eyes closed, savoring the sweetness. Minutes ticked by. Then, a change. The lines around Helen's eyes, etched by years of laughter and worry, seemed to soften, fade. Her hand, reaching for his across the table, appeared smoother. The faint age spots vanished. Stan recoiled as if burned, his stomach churning with a potent cocktail of fear and disgust. It was true. The serum, the lies, the deceit, it was all true. His Helen, his wife, was literally slipping away from him. The phone rang, shattering the heavy silence that had descended upon the room. It was the private investigator Stan had hired, his last-ditch attempt to either confirm his suspicions or silence them forever. "Mr. Miller?" The voice on the other end was gruff, all business. "I have something to report about your wife." Stan gripped the phone tighter, his knuckles white. He already knew. He'd seen it with his own eyes. But the confirmation, spoken aloud, felt like a punch to the gut. "She's been seeing a specialist," the investigator continued, oblivious to the turmoil on the other end of the line. "A dermatologist. Seems Mrs. Miller is quite concerned about those wrinkles, eh?" The investigator chuckled, mistaking Stan's silence for amusement. But Stan heard nothing. He could only see the empty vial, a symbol of his own unfounded jealousy, his colossal mistake. He'd been so blinded by his own insecurities, he hadn't even considered the truth. Helen was getting younger. Younger and younger still. Her features, once so familiar, were now blurring into a youthful image he hardly recognized. Her voice, once husky with experience, had taken on a higher pitch, a childlike lilt. Panic seized him. He rushed to her side, ignoring her startled cry, her confused pleas. "Helen," he choked out, the weight of his actions crushing him. "I know about the serum. Why, Helen? Why?" But the woman before him was no longer the Helen he knew. The serum had stripped away more than just years. It had stolen her memories, her very essence. She stared up at him with wide, innocent eyes, a stranger in his wife's diminishing form. The truth hit him like a physical blow. He'd condemned them both to this nightmare. His jealousy, his distrust had blinded him to the truth. Helen hadn't betrayed him. She'd been trying to hold on to him, to rekindle the spark of their youth for their anniversary. The anniversary he'd forgotten. The transformation was complete. Cradled in his arms, swaddled in a blanket, lay not his wife, but an infant. His Helen, reborn into a life he himself had inadvertently created. Remorse, sharp and relentless, tore at him. He'd destroyed their present, their future, in a fit of unfounded suspicion, but he would not let it destroy their entire world. He held her close, the warmth of her tiny body a stark contrast to the icy dread that gripped his heart. "It's okay, little one," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. "Daddy's here." He would raise her as his daughter now, shower her with the love he'd almost denied them both. He would tell her stories of her former self, of the woman she'd been, the woman he'd loved and lost. And he would spend every single day atoning for his sin, praying for a miracle, hoping that one day, somehow, his Helen might forgive him.